verse-by-verse study. I have had two more suggestions, Job and Galatians. So that'll probably be where we'll go after we're done with Malachi. Let's bow for a word of prayer and we'll get into Malachi. Father, thank you that we can be here this evening. I know there's been an awful lot of crazy weather in the last week or two, and creeks are coming up quite a bit with the ground saturated with all the rain and the melting snow. And I trust that you would keep folks safe and give them wisdom about those situations if it rains all night tonight and tomorrow. Thank you that we can gather together and look at this book and the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And what a incredible character this author is. Help it to be an encouragement to us, a rebuke to us, an exhortation to leave everything and passionately follow our Lord Jesus Christ. For it's in his name we pray. Amen. Malachi chapter 1. Interesting way to start. The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord, yet I loved Jacob. And I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts. They shall build, but I will throw down. And they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever. And your eyes shall see, and ye shall say, the Lord will be magnified from the border of Israel. A son honoreth his father, and a servant his master. If I then be a father, where is my honor? And if I be a master, where is my fear? Saith the Lord of hosts unto you, O priests that despise my name. And ye say, wherein have we despised thy name? Ye offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and ye say, wherein have we polluted thee? And that ye say, the table of the Lord is contemptible. And if ye offer the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? And if ye offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee, or accept thy person, saith the Lord of hosts? And now I pray you, beseech God that he will be gracious unto us. This has been your means. Will he regard your persons, saith the Lord of hosts? Who is there even among you that would shut the doors for naught? Neither do you kindle fire on mine altar for naught. I have no pleasure in you, saith the Lord of hosts, neither will I accept an offering at your hand. For from the rising of the sun, even unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles. And in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering. For my name shall be great among the heathen, saith the Lord of hosts. But ye have profaned it, in that ye say, the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. Ye said also, behold, what a weariness it is. And ye have snuffed at it, saith the Lord of hosts. And ye brought that which was torn, and the lame, and the sick. Thus ye brought an offering. Shall I accept this of your hand, saith the Lord? But cursed be the deceiver which hath in his flock a male, and voweth and sacrificeth unto the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathen. Malachi is a very interesting book, and it garners much interest because we know nothing of Malachi. So I want to look at some things to set the scene tonight so that as we work our way through here, they'll come back to your mind as we progress through the book. The first thing, let's look at the person here, Malachi. His name is literally Malak. It means my angel or my messenger. It's usually translated my messenger, and we'll turn here in a minute and look at an example. But because it sometimes is translated by angel, there are some that believe this means the book was written by an angel. And I do not hold to that. 2 Peter 1:21 obviously says, but holy men of God moved through the working of the Holy Spirit. Now, it doesn't mean that angels weren't involved, because we know that angels were involved in giving the Bible. Now, turn to Galatians chapter 3 and verse 19. In Galatians 3 and verse 19. Wherefore then serveth the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. A mediator is a go-between. It doesn't say that the angels delivered it written out to someone. Go to Acts chapter 7. They're getting ready to stone Stephen. And one of the most incredible sermons recorded in the Bible from anyone other than Jesus Christ, in my opinion, is the one we have here of Stephen, when he is allowed to give his defense before they stone him. Now, and if you look at verses 52 and 53 of Acts chapter 7, he basically is giving the nation of Israel a big history lesson all the way up through the coming of Jesus Christ and how he is the Messiah and how they killed the Messiah. And that's kind of what makes him so angry. But in verses 52 and 53 of Acts chapter 7, it says, which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain them which showed before of the coming of the just one, of whom ye have been now the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. It leads us to believe that angels were involved in Mount Sinai when the word was being given to Moses. But the problem here is just going by the name alone kind of lends credence to the Mormons who believe in the golden tablet that Moroni delivered down to their wonderful leader and had somehow got lost after he wrote the Book of Mormon. And it's very dangerous territory there, because that makes an angel seem more important than just the deliverer of the message. All right? If you think about Malachi as my messenger, that is actually the meaning of angel. It's what an angel is. The literal meaning of an angel is messenger of God. So to say that Malachi means messenger, well, this had to be an angel, I don't think is true. Go to chapter 3 of Malachi and look at verse 1, because the exact same word is going to be used here twice. And you'll see how different the translation of messenger is from assuming that an angel is who wrote this book, okay? And you'll notice that this word is going to describe two different people. Now, in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, behold, I will send my Malach, messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the Malach of the covenant whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. Now, we know from studying John, we looked at this verse, what two people are being talked about in Malachi 3, verse 1. The first messenger is the one preparing the way. That would be John B. Absolutely. The second messenger is going to come suddenly to the temple, and that's the one that they've been looking for, so that's obviously a reference to Jesus as the Messiah. Same word that is the name of the person writing the book is used here to describe two other messengers. And so I think you got to be really careful about adding to or assuming something, because there's three different ways in this same book that this word is used. It's describing an author, it's describing John the Baptist, and it's describing the Messiah. The other thing that this brings up for several commentaries is this is actual name of a literal person, Or is this his description? Some people in the Old Testament were known for prophesying, and folks would say the prophet. And everybody knew who they were talking to in the time period because it was, that guy. He's the only one who's really vocal. He's the only one that the Lord's really using to speak. And so there are some folks that say this author here is so obscure that and it's true, we know nothing about him. But we don't even know his name because he was the messenger, and that's all he is referred to. And while it's easy to make a big deal out of that, think about this for a minute. Let's look at his background. If I were to ask you about Paul, and you thought about it for a little while, you could probably start shooting back or answering a whole lot of trivia questions about Paul, because we know so much about him. In fact, as we're going through Hebrews, there are several times throughout that book where you almost have to say, man, I'm just about convinced that this was Paul. Sounds like him, writes like him, loves like him. You know, when you know so much about somebody, even when he is so careful to leave his name out of the book, there are some things in there that would really cause you to wonder, kind of seems like Paul maybe wrote this book. But maybe not, because there's other people that could have. Okay? There's no ancestry for Malachi. There is no mention of him in a lineage anywhere. Like nothing. We don't have a Bubba begat Malachi and Malachi begat. There's no way to timeline him because of the Bubbas that begat. There's no way to put him into context because of that. So you literally have to take clues from the book to figure that out. Along with that, there's no extra biblical history of Malachi. There are no Jewish writings. There are no historians that comment on Malachi. And so there's literally no information about him. And then to add more to it, he doesn't talk about himself at all in the book. There is no personal reference. There's nothing about what he does, what his job is. There is absolutely no mention of him whatsoever. The only thing we have is in chapter 1 and verse 1, we have a name, and that's all you get throughout the whole book. We know absolutely nothing about the messenger, but we do know an awful lot. That the messenger isn't important, but the message is important. When I started digging into this, I'm thinking, sometimes what God doesn't tell us is as important as some of the things he tells us, because it helps us to focus our attention where it ought to be. And when we started into Hebrews, all of these commentaries are spending pages and pages and pages, why they believe it's this writer, or why they believe it's this writer, or why they believe it's this writer. And the whole point of not telling us who is writing the book of Hebrews is so that we won't read anything into it. We'll just study the book of Hebrews because it is jam-packed with so much stuff. I think of the book of Malachi as the Old Testament equivalent to Hebrews. There's so much in here that is transitional about challenging the folks against their sin and exhorting them to Jesus Christ that fits not only in the writer's day, but in our day right now. Because as we go through here, we're going to see that they were up against some problems that a lot of our modern philosophy talks about as well. And I think the focus is where it needs to be. Not on who wrote the book or delivered the book, but on what the book is trying to say. Time period. Well, usually, if you know who wrote it, you can kind of tell what the time period is. But you got to go about this a little differently because we don't know anything about who wrote it. The temple is rebuilt after the Jews returned from Babylon, from Nebuchadnezzar. And we see that reflected here in chapter 1, verse 13, in chapter 3, verse 1, and chapter 3, verse 10. So that gives us insight into the fact that this is one of the last writers. Now we know he is the last. writer of the Old Testament. But the temple has already been rebuilt, and so that kind of gives us a contextual clue. Also refers in chapter 1 verse 8 to the governor. Offer it now unto thy governor. If they didn't have a governor, you wouldn't be able to say that. You couldn't challenge the folks to take their awful sacrifice that they're getting ready to give to God and take to the governor if they don't have a governor. Okay? So the fact that he is referring to a governor means that this has to be Nehemiah's time period, because Nehemiah was their last civil ruler. And he hasn't passed away yet, or they wouldn't be saying, go offer this to your leader. So that puts it somewhere between Nehemiah's first and second trip, and quite possibly during his second trip back to set things right. The sin and the problems that Malachi is going to address here in the book are the same ones that Nehemiah is dealing with in his second return. They had poor crops and faltering economy, chapter 3 and verse 11. That's the result of sin. Intermarriages with pagans, chapter 2 and verse 11. Defiled priesthood, chapter 1 verse 13 on through part of chapter 2. The poor were being oppressed. Their peers were being oppressed in chapter 3, verse 5. Lack of support for the temple in chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. And then we have general disdain for religion in chapter 1, verses 13, and it carries on into chapter 2. That's why I kind of wanted to read chapter 1 so you could pick up on some of those things. Malachi is the last prophet for Israel before the coming of Messiah. And so it kind of sets this up as a very unique book. Let's talk about the book for just a minute. Orientation. It deals with the past because it's the last Old Testament book. It is rebuking the decline of godliness in the nation of Israel. And then God is going to go silent for 400 years, and then he's going to introduce his son. And all they know to look for is that someone like Elijah, who's going to end up being John the Baptist, is going to be the forerunner. And so if they're paying attention and they're watching, then they'll recognize John the Baptist for who he is and what he's doing. Not just a great prophet, but they should be able to draw the correlation between, hey, wait a second, the Messiah should be coming because this is the forerunner. So it's important in that regard. But there's anticipation of the new. Because throughout the book there's this expectation of John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is going to prepare the way. And so it's almost like 400 years you're not going to say a word. But for those 400 years, these folks are supposed to be anticipating and thinking and looking for the coming of Jesus Christ. And what's interesting is the Bible is complete. We're not hearing anything new from God. The canon's done. And now, for hundreds of years, we're in the same situation because he tells us in his word that we should be looking for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And he told us, here are some things that are, that you can look for and know that the time is drawing nigh. But nobody's ever going to know when the time will be. So be prepared for it. It's the same situation that Malachi is leaving the Old Testament folks in. Transitional. Judaism to Christianity and revelation to redemption. There's a lot of revelation in the New Testament. Things that were a mystery, the church, grace. There's a lot of things in the New Testament that are going to be revealed. But the Old Testament has been revealing about God and how we are sinful and how we stand before him and how much of a failure we are trying to keep the law. And now it's going to transition from the coldness of the law to the warmness of redemption. So it makes it a pretty beautiful book. Throughout this book, he's going to talk about two ordinances, ministry and marriage. Ministry, the church, and how we worship. Y'all are not doing this right. Y'all are not doing this right. Y'all are not doing this right. This is what you ought to be doing. So he's constantly rebuking, and then he's constantly exhorting towards the right. And marriage is the same way. You have a bunch of folks that are unequally yoked. You have folks that are treating their spouses horribly. You have people being unkind to each other, rampant divorce, and they're dealing treacherously with each other. And he's going to keep saying, sin in the camp, here's how we fix it and get on the way we know we ought to. And then the style. The style of the book is interesting, and maybe you picked up on it in a couple of verses. We'll emphasize them a little bit later. He states a thought as a generally accepted truth. So in other words, when he states it from God's viewpoint and says, this is the truth. And you're expected to believe it that way. He's not saying, I wonder if this is true. He's dropping it in front of them and saying, this is a generally accepted truth. And then he's going to develop the idea by alternating between addressing and replying. This is the truth. You say, here's God's response. And he keeps on doing that as he goes through the book. And there's seven different ways. We'll touch on them quickly. He addresses an attitude of the mind that considers man superior to God. And you'll see that as we go through here, because when they try to refute, they are going to attempt to measure God with human morality. That's the yardstick that they're going to use. And it comes up with the thought, how have we done this? You said we've done this. How have we done this? You show me, according to what we're doing, how we've done this. They want to change the measuring stick from what God is saying to what they're saying. There are 7, and I don't want to take a long time and look at these, but in chapter 1, verse 2, I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, how hast thou loved us? And every time it challenges God's statement and demands that he give an accounting of himself in human terms. See what? I have loved you, saith the Lord. That is a general statement. Now we're going to have that give and take. Wherein hast thou loved us? Or how hast thou loved us? You prove to me on my terms how you've loved me. It's not a generally, well, it should be a generally accepted because God has loved them. But it's kind of a rejection of that and saying, no, you come and you prove it to me on my terms. Chapter 1, verse 6, we see it again. Chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 2, verse 17, chapter 3, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 8, and chapter 3, verse 13. And so you're going to notice as we go through these 7 things and discuss them that this book is a mirror of human thinking today, where people are constantly challenging God to come down and prove himself on my terms. It's dangerous thinking. Malachi always anticipates the objections of the people, and he meets them head on. This is what God says, but you say, he answers the complaint. And when you read the book, it's like you can see people 7 times saying, how have you? And he turns right around and he answers it. And so he raises their objection before they have a chance to, and then he dashes it with truth, and then gives them an opportunity to respond. Now, the purpose, rebuke sin. And there is some rampant sin here against God and against one another that he's going to address throughout the book. The return to the Lord, and then anticipate Christ. So we're going to see those purposes as we move our way through here. The audience, who's he writing to? What time period are we dealing with here? Well, we have nation of Israel who is very ungrateful to God. You would think after all that he has done for them, especially since they have been captive in Babylon for 70 years, and now they've had this incredible opportunity to return. You think about it. What king allows all those folks that he had to go and kick their hind ends and wreck their city, allows them to go back and rebuild their city and rebuild their temple? I mean, if you can't see that God is working in your life and guiding and directing, and then Nehemiah comes back and there's all kinds of trouble, and yet very quickly and in a very organized way, they build the wall despite all the trouble. And Nehemiah is constantly saying, you know who did this? You know who did this, right? You know who did this? And then he has to return to Shushan the palace, and he is serving the king, and everything starts falling apart, and they still don't have the temple done. And so you have Ezra who comes in, and I can't remember the other prophet, rebuking the nation of Israel for not building the temple, and they finally get their act together and they finish the temple, and here comes Nehemiah back the second time, and they're not treating God right and they're not treating each other right, and it's mayhem and chaos. And he's setting it right, okay? Very ungrateful to God for what he has done. It also has an audience that's very careless and remiss in worship and treating the holidays and the sacred days very haphazardly. You have lazy and corrupt priests because they're putting up with it. If somebody brings in a lamb with a broken leg and for an offering, what priest in his right mind is accepting that offering and burning it on the altar? It should never happen. There should have been someone standing there rebuking and rejecting and then exhorting them to do what's right. But you have lazy and corrupt priests that are just going through the motions. And we see a lot of that in religion today. Folks get all worked up and whooped up on a Sunday, but what is there that has any real life-solving problems and help for everyday living? And lastly, they don't treat each other very well. In the homes, because of the way they treat their spouses, in their business applications, as neighbors. And so society has kind of collapsed in the nation of Israel. Worship has fallen apart, and society has fallen apart. And in steps Malachi, and we know nothing of this guy. Nothing. I mean, there are people that are mentioned in the Bible that get their name mentioned here and there that we have a little bit of information about. We know nothing of Malachi, except he writes a very interesting, very intriguing, very challenging book in a very difficult time. That's what we're going to start digging into. And you can tell by the introduction, the burden of the word of the Lord. I mean, who starts that way? Who would think that the word of the Lord is a burden? Well, it's a burden if everything in your life is fluff and nonsense and has no meaning, has no truth, has no value. Praises or prayer requests?